All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're sitting this afternoon in the very, very comfortable home of Mr. and Mrs. Hubie Sweeny in Westport, Connecticut. The date is Friday, February 21st, 2003. The home of the folks better known as Jim and Johnny Sweeny, known to thousands, better still hundreds of thousands, of both young and old adults. Jim as Mr. Junior Achievement, literally a gentleman who probably knows more, remembers more, and has had more input and impact on the Junior Achievement organization than any other individual that I can identify or that we can think of. So it's a great honor to be talking to Jim this afternoon and to capture some of the history of the organization, but especially his role, something about his life and his role in the tremendous success of the Junior Achievement organization over the years. Jim, if we can begin, maybe we'll ask you to share a few comments about where you were born, where you grew up, where you went to school.
I was born and grew up in Plainfield, New Jersey, a town southwest of New York. Mostly commuters these days. It used to be a manufacturing town. I went to Plainfield High School, the class of 1931, Princeton, class of 35. Worked a few years for the telephone company as a student engineer, looking because I needed a job. Then the Army came along and gave me a job for 5 years. I came out in 1945, back from Germany, looking for a job, and had a temporary one with the March of Dimes Commerce and Industry campaign. That led indirectly to Junior Achievement, because one of the contacts was J.M. Mathis of the advertising agency to send out a letter to that field. His secretary said he probably couldn't do it this year because he was so interested and so busy with Junior Achievement. And she showed me some of the literature. I casually noticed that it was a very interesting program that involved some top business people in the country supporting it. So a couple months later, when my temporary job ended, I mentioned my fundraising experience at one of the employment interviews. And at that time, JA was starting a class of new staff people. I got to see the office the day they were packing up to go to the training session, and was given an option to go along with them with no commitment, and if at the end of the 2 weeks we could agree on whether I would work there or not, and at what of several salary ranges that were offered, we had a deal. Well, I went, and we had a deal. I was impressed with the training and with the people involved. It was very familiar in some of the concepts to what I had experienced in my early years in the Army at a training center, and I knew I could do that sort of thing. My first assignment was in...
Jim, I'm going to interrupt. Yeah. I'm going to interrupt you 1 second, because we've raced through and covered an awful lot of early history very quickly, and I really think the folks would like to know a little bit more about some of your earlier years before we get into your JA career. You mentioned where you grew up and where you went to school and so forth. Do you have any significant childhood memories that you'd care to share?
Well, there were two that had a particular significance. One was that my family moved out to the outskirts of town near the football field, baseball field of the local high school. And when I was a freshman in the high school, the coach for football and baseball, who was a neighbor of ours, asked me if I'd like to be a manager of the baseball team over to start in. I could become manager after 3 years. I guess it was because I lived near where the gate was that the players went home through, and I could lock up after them. Anyway, that gave me some status in school that I had never had before, and led in my senior year, from some things I was doing, to making, I was on the high school assembly program to make an announcement of some activity. There was a stranger on the platform along with the superintendent of schools and the principal. Turned out he was Lefty Davies, secretary of the Princeton Alumni Council, giving a Encyclopedia Britannica set to the school because last year's freshman at Princeton, Bob Coates from that same high school, had the highest grades of any freshman, and that was their way of rewarding the school. After the program, I went over to be introduced, and Lefty Davies, in front of the superintendent, asked me where I was going to college. This was in the spring of 1931, and I really wasn't thinking much about college, with what things were in the community and my family. I said if I did anything, I'd buy a second-hand car and day student at Rutgers. But he said, for the benefit of the superintendent and principal, and ultimately for my benefit, he said, if you will go to Princeton and interview with the director of admission, see what could be worked out, would you do it? Well, I did, and it was worked out. And through the help of some scholarship aid and 4 years working in the dining halls, I got a degree in 1935. That really was a momentous occasion because I would have gone an entirely different route had Lefty Davies not been on the program that day.
What type of degree was it, Jim?
Bachelor of Arts. I was majored in philosophy. I did my senior thesis covered 3 departments: politics, economics, and philosophy. It was the story of the National Recovery Administration Act that was very important in the politics and in the economy of the time.
I'm going to take a brief pause here just to double check that we are recording with quality here. Just a quick pause. Jim, thanks for that background. Now let's go back to, as you mentioned earlier, your first employment experience in New Jersey.
Well, right at the beginning, an incident occurred that was typical of what I knew all through 32 years in JA. A wonderful program and an organization that very often failed miserably. My whole fate in JA changed because in New York, right after the training for some orientation, in the office of the president, of the executive director, George Tamlin, it came out after a meeting, and the switchboard operator said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Tamlin, there's a call for you from Mr. Pugh in Philadelphia. I told him you were in conference." Well, George, knowing Mr. Pugh, who was the president of Sun Oil, dashed to his phone to call Pugh back, and was told that Mr. Pugh was in conference and would be for quite a while. So I had been slated to go to Philadelphia, but Philadelphia didn't start for years later, and with the help of the electric company, not the Sun Oil. As a result of that experience, a fork in the road, if you will, I was farmed out to the New Jersey program in Newark for a few months.
What kind of training had you had up to this point, Jim?
2 weeks of how to tie the underwriter's knot and a bit of history of the program and a description of a tentative new program synthesizing what had been done in the past and elaborated upon by Herman Gall, who had been with JA in St. Louis, and a Rome Collin, who had been with the Training Within Industry program. It was a merger of these men collaborating, one on the idea of what to do, the other, the trainer, on how to put the idea across.
Let me just stop here and ask you, what intrigued you about signing on with Junior Achievement? I mean, what was appealing about it?
I needed a job, and I felt that it was something I could do. It involved a move to some other location. That was obvious, but that was okay because we were living in a tiny apartment my wife had found while I was overseas during the war. So we were ready to move, and I was impressed with that interview at the Mathis place months before, where I had gotten insight into just the kind of good people that were back at JA. And I thought that was something worth trying.
Well, let's remember where we are now. You're on your way to Philadelphia, but now you've mentioned 2 things.
Now I don't go to Philadelphia because Mr. Pugh was insulted.
That's right. Well, we'll pick up here, but now let's back up a little bit. You mentioned 2 things I'd like to talk about. First of all, you mentioned your wife. I'm assuming that's Johnny.
Right.
And you mentioned the military. Tell us a little bit, first of all, about your military experience. What years and
Well,
what did you do?
I was in ROTC in college and went to a few summer camps, and then in the spring of 1940, the telephone company decided that I was going to be taken off of the trainee program, and in a tactful way, I took the hint and quit. The very night that I quit, I was in a little theater group in Plainfield. We had our annual party for the members and their friends, and that's where I met Johnny, the day I lost my job. I had an attempt to get into the insurance business through an uncle of mine with Northwestern Mutual. But the war was on, and the Germans in May 1940, of course, invaded the lowlands in France. And I was, in my area, my regiment of artillery, I was one of the first three called up involuntarily, although I was ready for it, in November 1940. I went out to Oklahoma to school and then to the training center at Oklahoma and stayed there, grew up with it from first lieutenant to major until I left in the spring of 43. Then I went to an interdivision, the 102nd Infantry, and training in Texas, and overseas in the summer of 44, and through France and Holland and Germany, and came back in September of 45.
So you saw plenty of action then?
Yes, we were in a couple of substantial attacks, and an interesting part of it was that from the middle of April, really, until I came back, we were involved with, before military government was established, units were assigned an area of territory to supervise, look for contraband, look for Nazis, and just try to get things going again. And that was very interesting because there were some positive things, and sadly enough, there were some eye-opener things like some of the atrocities that the Germans created. One of my most memorable experiences was just even before the war was over. I went in a town hall where a very well-spoken German woman, well-dressed, was harassing the lieutenant in charge. She turned over to me, and she said, I've been trying to explain to this young man, I want some soldiers to come and make my Poles go back to work on her farm. And I said, Madam, the war wasn't over yet. But I said, Madam, you must realize that they are not your Poles anymore. And fortunately, actually, I thought she was lucky. All they did was not go to work, because other places they were looting and getting revenge at the people who'd oppressed them for so long. But I was glad to taper off that way and come back to the States. And by then I was a lieutenant colonel, and looking for the very first week back, a friend of mine working for Northwestern Mutual knew I was back and called up and said that a client of his in New York was looking for men in their Commerce and India division of the March of Dimes, just to call on business people to write letters to other people in the same line of business to contribute to the March of Dimes. And that little bit of fundraising experience was really what got me going into junior achievement, because they were looking for both supervisory skills and fundraising experience.
And how did you meet Johnny?
We met at this drones party, the theater group party.
And how long before you popped the question, before you proposed?
Well, that was some years later, because we stopped going together before I went in the Army, because there was no future for me without a job.
Right.
And then I got sent back east to Fort Monmouth in the fall of 41 and looked her up, and we resumed dating. I went back to Sill with nothing decided, but after a few months I proposed by telephone and came east to get married in June of 42. Yeah, June of 42.
And now let's advance to. You want to take a break, Jim?
No.
Okay, let's advance to again the opportunity to take your first junior achievement position.
Well, I was
You
there.
were telling me that
I was
you
there
weren't going to go to Philadelphia.
Right.
So
they farmed me out to the office in Newark that had programs supposedly in quite a number of towns in northern New Jersey. The staff conference that year was a small one in Michigan, and I was not on the budget to go, so I spent the time while the others were away liquidating defunct JA companies in the area. Because at that time the program supposedly went on and on, but it didn't. And when I got to Hartford in the second year of the new 2-year program, I found that that didn't work either.
Now, what do you mean the program supposedly went on and on, Jim?
In the old days, before about 1941, there was the idea was that people, well, for instance, what I found in Newark, a lot of the companies were internal within particular plants. The young people, young employees, were invited to have this activity experience, and then they went on to other things. The war came along, and the bank account was sitting there, and nothing was being done about it, so I closed them out. What Mr. Gall and Mr. Rome Collin had done was construct a theoretical program with no practical testing that would last 2 years, a junior and senior year in high school. You would recruit people in the junior year, and they would continue on in the senior year. The fact is, in the very first 2 years of it, it all fell apart because they did not continue. They had other interests, and the dilemma was that if the first year had been successful and made money, those people left without cashing in what they had earned. And if they lost money, they had to recruit new people the second year to come into a losing proposition.
Interesting. Jim, what was Rome Collin?
My attention to JA program came, I think, from my objecting
From that experience.
to that experience
Yeah.
at staff meetings.
And the rest is history.
The rest
believe me.
is history.
Yeah.
The first thing I did when I got to New York, in the national office, was to get rid of a complicated award program like Sunday school pins, and also to get rid of the so-called 2-year program, which wasn't.
Right. What was Rome Collins' role in junior achievement? You mentioned
he started out as a trainer, and then in 1950, well, in 1946, after he finished this initial training role for the new trainees, he repeated it with other groups of new staff, and then he also became like executive assistant to George Tamlin, the director.
George Tamlin was the chief staff officer.
Chief staff
CEO
officer.
Of junior
he had
achievement.
come to the New York people, the New York program. He had come to them as a fundraiser. His father had a fundraising business, and he latched on to the beauty of the idea and got himself to be the director.
And Herman, I'm sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
Herman Gall had
His role was to recruit.
His role was to develop the program.
I see. Okay.
He'd been the director of a small program in St. Louis, and out of that he evolved this more formalized, complicated program that didn't work.
Jim, when you first came on board, how large was junior achievement? How much of the country was being served?
The furthest west was Chicago and St. Louis, although they called themselves national.
Okay.
But they did go as far as Denver in 1949, and they went to the West Coast in 1950.
Okay.
And then filled in between through the 50s.
Okay. Okay, let's go back now. Describe your first assignment.
Well, my first assignment after Newark.
Yes, after Newark.
At the conference that I did not attend in Michigan, the new director in Connecticut, a man named E.J. McCabe, thrilled them all with his stories of how great he was and what a wonderful program he developed. Without ever checking up on the ground, Mr. McCabe was hired as the national field director, and he failed in that in a most spectacular way, so that I took his place in Connecticut. in this fall of '46 when he became National Field Director.
What was the responsibility then that you took on?
The whole state.
Okay.
There were programs, a real program was going in Bristol, Connecticut. That was the epitome of all that the Junior Achievement Company program was ever supposed to be. It had top leadership in the community. It had cooperation in the schools. It had wonderful kids, and a lot of them, and in a small way. There were 10 JA companies in a town of 20-some thousand. Then when I was there only a year and a half, when Mr. McCabe's failings caught up with him, and he was gracefully moved back to Connecticut, which brought me to New York, not to replace him, but to create a new program job called Program Director, because Herman Gall was trying to run the program from St. Louis, the way some of the modern JA field people try to run the program from their homes far from where the action is. Now, Mr. Gall was in that same position. I came to New York.
Now, what year was that?
1948.
And when you say you came to New York, so the national office?
National office was in New York, 345 Madison Avenue.
345 Madison.
It's been there for a few years. It was a nice commute. I found a house in the town next to where we'd grown up, so our relatives were near.
What town was that?
Fanwood, New Jersey, a wonderful little place with a joint school district, one high school. We lived in a dead-end street, a half a mile of woods behind us, and a little field down the foot of the street where the kids could play ball. It was wonderful for our boys growing up.
How did you commute every year? Every day, I should say.
Well, by train for a few years. Then after about 10 years, we moved to the other side of town to a little bigger place. And at that time, I found there was an express bus right down at the corner. So I took the bus in instead of the train. Only a short time on the bus, and I met a man who got on the next stop. Together we formed a carpool, and for years after that, until I left in 1974, I commuted into New York by carpool.
Now we're going to pick up again in your role in New York, but let's take just a brief break. Jim, you mentioned your family and your boys and so forth. Let's backtrack a little bit and have you talk about when they were born, where they were born, and tell us a little bit about your family during this period of time.
Well, Chip had been born in Austin, Texas, and David in Hartford in 1948. And shortly after David was born, the JA office wanted to have some of the staff people go to areas that had been organized out of phase with the new one-year program that was underway. And I went to Cleveland to hold the fort with the new board to make preparations for hiring a staff man to go into spring training and start a program in the fall. And it all worked out just as planned. But Cleveland was a good interlude because it gave me a chance to test some of the theories I was forming in my new job in New York, and to visit around a little bit in that part of the country. Found a chance to find a wonderful site for the National Achievers Conference at Denison University, the first time we had it in a college, which is what our pattern was from then on.
Now, whose idea was the National Junior Achievement Conference? How did that come about?
The National Junior Achievers Conference was an idea dating from 1944 when the first one was held. It was supposed to be the National Association of Junior Achievement Companies with one representative from each company. But it was, in a practical way, it never worked out that way. Only a few people came. It was held outside Middletown, Ohio. Then in 1946, it was held in connection with the staff conference in Michigan. And that was not very successful because they had elected a kid as president who was very abrasive. And the long and short of it was that the acronym was retained, but the representative basis was conceded and abolished. So in 1947, they had a conference at a rundown summer camp in northern New Jersey that was a great welder of the people that took part, because all the adversities they had in the physical layout made them very good friends for the rest of their lives. I found out when I came there in '48 that I was supposed to run the conference as part of my duties. It had already been reserved at Oglebay Park, Wheeling, West Virginia, a lovely estate that had been given by Crispin Ogleby, who I had worked with in starting up Cleveland. The only trouble was, again, the difference between the program and the organization of it. Wheeling was segregated. And so some very fine black kids, including Cecil Brown from Milwaukee, who'd been written up in our national magazine, were unable to go. It was too late to change the reservation, but I did take it on as a challenge, and I went out there, looked in on the Pittsburgh JA office, which was something out of this world, made arrangements to receive the kids at the station, park them at the Bell Phone Company auditorium until all were in, and rent a bus to go down to Wheeling. Made a deal with the U.S. Steel to have a luncheon and a plant tour at the Homestead plant at the last day of the conference on the way home. And we went down there. We had 3 cabins, the girls in one cabin, and the boys divided in 2 cabins.
How many delegates total?
About 60.
So this was your first conference.
And I was all by myself. They had an advisor, a woman advisor, chaperone, a nice lady from Boston, Sears Roebuck. They had a couple from St. Louis, because I'd been the pattern to have adult chaperones, so cool. The couple took one look at the accommodations and disappeared for the rest of the week. I set myself in the what I called the big boys cabin. It was a smaller cabin, but it was the kids that had been to the 1947 conference. I put some of the kids I had known from Hartford in what I called the little boys cabin, which was the big cabin, and Dan O'Keefe, who was in college and was working as editor of Achievement magazine. So it was a very informal time, but I got a feeling of the flavor of it and the great enthusiasm that could be engendered. And I'm still in touch with the conference secretary that year, Betty Wemmen, Crennan Wirtz of Ann Arbor, Michigan.
That's great.
Saw her here just a couple of years ago. But the Hartford kids that were there helped me too, because they knew who I was and they were supportive. But I just knew that it had to get better than that. So in 1949, we went to, as I said, Denison University, because I found the location when I was in Cleveland. And from then on, it was colleges. And a long run at Indiana University from 1957 through 1977 for me, and they continued on until 1983.
And of course, the conference grew every year from that point on.
It did. My last year, 1977, there were about 3,000 achievers, about 350 on the volunteer staff, and a couple of hundred visitors. It really was big. And the problem was that you lost something with the bigness, but you sure gained something too, because you had a larger nut for administrative costs, you had more excitement, you had a chance for greater diversity in programming. For instance, in the latter years, I made a point of segregating the returning delegates, except for a few leadership types in each of the 60 groups of 50 each. And that meant that that most of them were not going to be back in the program. They'd won the trip as an award for what they'd done in the past. They were on their way to jobs or college. So the program for them that week was not discussing much about a JA company, but about college and about jobs and about things that were significant to them.
Sure. Jim, in just a moment, I want to go back to your other duties as National Program Director, but talking about the Achievers Conference, what do you think the greatest value of that conference was to both the students and to junior achievement?
Well, I think the advantage to the students, very definitely, or achievers. I intend to call them achievers.
Right.
This is their JA roles.
I should know better.
They're
Of
not
course,
school
they're
kids
achievers,
anymore.
right?
The advantage to them was a chance to size up their own experience with that of the others. And early on, I made arrangements in these college dormitories that a criteria for a roommate was to select someone from another part of the country, always someone from the same grade in school, so they had comparable maturity level and experience level, but always someone from another part of the country. And that became one of the most valued parts of the conference to the participants. They told me that over and over. The other aspect of it was that with the size, I was able to have some planned diversification. Like we had a program called the Correspondence Plan for very small towns, maybe 1 or 2 JA companies, no staff person. I put all of them in the same group so they had a chance to share experiences. We had visiting delegates from Mexico and from Puerto Rico when there were programs there. They got in groups with a counselor who spoke Spanish and with other kids that had shown on their registration cards that they had some knowledge of Spanish. We even had kids from France when a program started there. They were in a group where the counselor spoke French, a couple other kids spoke French, that sort of thing. It was a chance to make the arrangements conducive to the best interaction between the kids.
How did you staff the conference, Jim, as it grew?
At the start, it was just me. By 1952, I had developed enough association with kids that had gone through the conference that I set up a full-fledged counselor program with a structure that was still going strong when I left in '77, and although it was diluted, it continued as long as the conference continued. The idea was that I wanted people new who had finished 1 year of college. They were only 1 year older than the oldest of the delegates. They were close to them, but also they were maybe too close to them. So I, right early on, put in what I call a unit structure. Every 6 or 7 groups had a supervisory staff of older, experienced, successful counselors. And then that wasn't enough. Units were formed into divisions, and at the end we had 3 divisions of 1,000 kids each at Indiana University. So there was a structure that provided continuity all the way. I was always a great believer in that. In my later years, we started having summer interns to help with the registration and to some extent with the contest, planning for them. There was continuity there. I insisted that I didn't want anybody, if they were only going to do it 1 year, I wanted them to be able to come back a few years and bring in new people.
Sure. Jim, how did the agenda, the conference makeup evolve over the years? For example, contests obviously became a very important part of the week's activity.
Well, when I started with JA, we had a few contests tied in with various trade associations that consisted of examining records and a sample of a product in New York. No contact with the kids. The evolution that I worked toward and succeeded at the conference was that the contest there, again sponsored by various businesses, appropriate business associations, had representatives to be interviewed, to be tested, to be examined right there on the spot with their records. And that made all the difference in the world, because you weren't playing games like the college admissions people do. You had the real live person there to interrogate. The Company of the Year program had 3 representatives of the company. The Officer of the Year, of course, each had just the 1 officer.
No question in terms of the benefit to the young people that went through that conference. And we could run through thousands and thousands of names of folks that would really testify to the fact that it was the experience of a lifetime.
As a matter of fact, you mentioned earlier about working for Orrin Smith in Milwaukee.
Right.
He was one of the staff people that I tangled with more than once, because he didn't like the fact that kids would come back from the conference with ideas that things could be better.
Tell him how to run your achievement.
They'd tell him they knew more than he did,
right.
because they
yes. Yeah.
You know, when you're dealing with other people in a friendly basis and you have the common denominator of that company experience, no matter what they're making, the basic makeup of the structure and all is the same. You can't help but succeed. You're either confirmed in your knowledge that you're on the right track, or you're challenged by the opportunity to cash in on some of these ideas that you pick up.
Jim, are there any moments at NAJAC that especially stand out in your mind?
Yes, there are several, some a little sensitive.
Any that you'd care to share? Something
Yes,
that you love to reminisce about
I
and
remember
that you're proud of?
We had a PR director in JA named Jim Langton, and he had been director for a year or two in Hamilton, Ohio, which was our host at one of the conferences at Bowling Green, at Miami of Ohio. And he had this great idea that he could get coverage in Life magazine if I would let them photograph the kids having a panty raid. And I told him I didn't think that was a very good idea, but the very rumor of it spread around, and I get stories that there's going to be a panty raid. Maybe he was going behind my back and trying to organize something. So my reaction was, well, by definition, it ain't no panty raid till the first panty gets raided. And we'll wait until that happens, and at that time, we'll take appropriate action. It never happened. Another occasion that I remember in the early days, we were still at, you remember, what was it called? the big H-shaped dormitory.
Oh, you mean it not in Miami?
No,
No.
At Bloomington.
Oh, Briscoe? No. I don't remember the names. There was McNutt, there was Briscoe.
McNutt.
And, yeah,
no,
McNutt.
that was the new area.
Okay, and then the other one.
Whatever. Yeah. I went to Indiana because Frank Johnson.
And Foster.
No, that was up the new area.
Oh, okay.
Frank Johnson, an achiever from New York, went to IU after he came back from Korea, and he sent me a postcard of this dorm. This is a great place to hold a conference. So on one of my trips, I looked in there, and it was a great place, and so that's why we had such a long and happy association. But this particular time, I had a rule from the early days that the counselors were free in their free time if they conducted themselves properly. They were responsible for conducting themselves properly. But certainly there would be no drinking on the dormitory area to set an example to the kids. Well, late one night, I roaming around to make sure everything was okay, and I came upon two young men, both looked up guiltily with a bottle between them. One of them, I flashed through my mind, Joe Cronin, who later became Commissioner of Education for the state of Massachusetts and one of our featured speakers at one of the conferences, getting the Achievement Award. Joe Cronin I could trust for an amicable discussion, but the boy with him had a gleam in his eye that told me that if I ever walked away from this, the word would be all over by morning. So I told them both, if they knew the rules, they were both to go home the next day. There was a bit of an abortive council rebellion led by a couple of them, and I told them that it's okay if they wanted to quit, because where I think you got people like them, I could find their replacement in a minute within the delegates that were there.
True.
So that was a dramatic time, but I never had another problem with that.
Sure.
Never had another problem. Another occasion was during the time of desegregation. We were absorbing very handily, probably better than anybody else, even including the U.S. Army. Kids for the first time, people were meeting people that they had never met before in their lives. And under the focus of the junior achievement program, they worked. But we had a lecture program, brief lecture when they got off the bus, saying a few things more specifically than we'd said in the printed material. The chief one was that we're all in this together to benefit from our JA experience. Regardless of who the other person is, you're going to treat them with respect. We can't control what's in your mind. We wish we could. We can't control what's in your mind. We can control your action, and no action of discourtesy to another achiever will be tolerated. Well, that went fine. That went fine all week long. Thursday afternoon at our final meeting, a boy from Boston, a white boy from Boston, got up in the auditorium and started shouting that we were discriminating. He had overheard some boys talking negatively about the fact that blacks were there. They hadn't done anything to a black. They were talking among themselves. He was an eavesdropper. But he threw the thing in turmoil. I came down, they would straighten it out. I was so hurt, sorry. That night, there was self-segregation by blacks at the dinner table, which we'd never had before. Because that boy had, well, my text maybe should have been more detailed, but then it would have been unintelligible. We hit the main point. But he was misguided. He was wrong. And fortunately, it was the last day, and by the next conference, he sure didn't come back, and we improved from then on.
Jim, you opened the campus to outside visitors one day a week. I think it was called VI&E Day.
Right.
Was that a successful effort? Was that your idea, or was
No, it was Joe Francomano's idea, and a great idea. The Bloomington Airport used to have the largest conglomeration of private executive planes in the country that day. Unfortunately, two things militated against it. One was that the busy executive, after the first time he went, the next year was all too inclined to send a substitute, someone lower in the hierarchy. And so we lost his participation. The other thing that happened was that our executive office wanted more catering to these people than really they wanted. And the net effect was that Wednesday night they had a dinner, and they were supposed to get to that was talent night, Wednesday night in the auditorium. They were supposed to get there at the intermission at talent night and see the rest of talent night. There were some awkward moments when they were late, and they loused up the whole evening's program in terms of the greater good for the greater number. It was a mistake. But it was a great advantage to have them there. I tried to sell the idea that instead of them coming and interrupting the conference, it would be better to have them observe during the afternoon if they were there, and to have the conference come to them at an after-dinner program in the person of some of our more expressive achievers. But I couldn't sell that idea. Yeah. I think it would have been better.
Just for the record, you mentioned Joe Francomano, a name certainly that all who know JA are familiar with, but what was Joe's role at that moment? Or what was his role at the national organization and his relationship to you, Jim?
The national organization, he was a featured speaker. He was in a JA program in Long Island in his team, the old program. He worked as like a stockroom boy, actually, at JA. And then his fluency, his poise, they started using him to make talks as the achiever, because as he matured, he had to shave more often and powder up to keep on the impression. But Joe's place in JA is best expressed by a tribute that Charles Hook of Armco Steel gave Joe at the time Charles Hook was honored at a meeting in New York. Mr. Hook had been president of the National Association of Manufacturers when JA got its big boost at a Waldorf dinner in 1941, this legendary in the organization. In his response, Mr. Hook said, "I appreciate being honored here, but who you ought to honor is the person that got me interested in the first place, and that's Joe Francomano." Because while Mr. Hook was in New York at a convention, he had been taken to a JA meeting that Joe was presiding at and was so impressed by this kid. Joe was miscast in his later years in JA because his forte was expansion. All of the expansion in the 50s was Joe holding organization meetings and recruiting a local board, moving on to another town. When Rome Collin was fired, Joe was brought into New York to be the assistant to John Hayne, the temporary executive on loan from from Chrysler in Detroit. And
what year was that, Jim?
this was around 1950.
At least close. It's probably tough to remember exactly.
Yeah, 55 or 6.
Okay, all right.
And Colin was fired, and Hayne came in. And
where was the national office? In New York?
Still in New York.
Still on Madison Avenue?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it might have moved. It moved.
Okay.
I know, but you know, this was the kind of organization problem that always plagued the program. I happened to be in my early days at one of the, to me it must have been one of the key meetings in JA. It was a staff conference in Chicago. It must have been after I'd been moved to the New York office. At luncheon at the hotel, I saw this, I came late, there was this empty seat. It was George Tamlin, Tom Pendergast, the director in Chicago, and his program director, Marion Jackson. I got right into the middle of the program about whether Chicago would pay participation charges. They had never paid them when the national office was set up because they claimed that, and truly so, they were set up before the national office was set up, out of dealing with Mr. Moses in Springfield. So they didn't owe participation. George Tamlin was a very creative guy. I guess on the spur of the moment, he said, I got there just to hear this conversation. He said, well, if you're not going to pay participation charges, which are another way of calling a franchise charge, you don't have the franchise. So I can then notify all JA areas that they may have their vendors who do business with anybody in Chicago try to get money for JA. Tom said they'll never give. Marion Jackson, to his credit, broke in and said, yeah, Tom, but they won't give to us either if they have such confusion. Within a year, to follow up the success of that, because Chicago started paying participation, within a year, Tamlin came up with a vendor campaign where areas got their vendors to write to people that they sold things to, or that they bought things from. And all over the country. If it was an operating area, that area got the money. If it was not an operating area, National got the money. Joe Francomano got the clue at people to call on to start a new area. It was dramatically brilliant. And I think it all came of that little sparring with Chicago. Yeah.
Jim, let's back up to 1947 again. The National Achievers Conference was a big part of your responsibilities and your life, as a matter of fact, but you certainly had other duties as National Program Director. Let's develop those a little bit. What other things did you focus on?
The first thing I did when I came to New York, before I had this temporary thing in Cleveland in fall and winter of 48, 49, but before that, I started studying this 2-year program. I got into charter applications.
Tell me again what the 2-year program was.
The idea was that they would start as juniors and continue back the second year.
For 2 years.
Would give 2 years experience.
During the school year.
During the school year. And it didn't work because for one reason or another, also it didn't work because at that time they did not start uniformly in the fall, which was my big fetus. They should start uniformly all around the country. Using the papers. Anyway, follow the school schedule. Right, they didn't start. So I studied charter applications. I found that there were the names on the second year renewal charter were not the same as on the first. I had to do over the book, the advisor handbook. The advisor handbook had all the details of the 2-year program. Well, I had to take that out. The way the book, I could do the part that was tight, but Rome Collin had done all the lesson plans for the first meetings in script, in printed script, to make it look real, real personal. Well, I had to try to copy his script, which I didn't do too successfully, to make those changes. So I got that changed. Then at the 1948 staff conference, my one contribution, my first conference in that job, I went around the table. How many actual operating JA companies did you have this year? Never mind the publicity. Never mind counting last year's and this year's all together. How many did you actually have? if I were to come there and interview people. We ended up with a magic number of 440, and we grew from then on because we were expanding. We were going to have growth anyway because Joe was doing the expansion.
440, and the year was again?
1947, 48.
Okay, great.
For the 49 conference, the then PR director had sold George Tamlin on a catchword theme. We're going to have 1,321 companies next year. When I found that out at the last minute, I hadn't been consulted. I pointed out to George that we were getting on solid ground. That would be a big mistake because nobody was going to produce 1,321 companies from 440. It wasn't in the works. So I respect him for the fact that he accepted my suggestion, threw out the 1321, and we had a good conference. And we've grown every year since.
Let me...
we grew every year since until 1970, when the then president stopped expansion.
Great. Let me ask you, what role did you have in getting out into the field? Because I remember when I was a youngster, the first time I saw you was when you visited the JA Center in Milwaukee.
Right.
And but I mean, you must have done a lot of on-site.
This was part of my charge from George Tamlin, particularly because of my pointing out the failure of the 2-year program. Nobody was checking up to see whether the printed word was being implemented. So he authorized me, got the budget. I would go days of prop planes. I started going with this interim of Cleveland, this interim of going back up to Hartford to get it going again after McCabe was fired. By the late fall of 49 into 1950, I started 2 weeks travel, 1 week back in the office. 2 weeks travel, 1 week back in the office. And one of those trips, to Johnny's continued regret, I took our new car out through the Midwest because it's so easy to get from city to city by car. So she was stranded with nothing but a wagon to take the groceries home.
And you were living, that your home was?
In Fanwood, New Jersey.
In Fanwood, all right.
But I did travel, and for that very reason, and George was very right, and I could see he was right, because the difference between the theory and the practice is where the rub comes. Now, I also was able then to pick up ideas to share with the other guys as I went around. Those that at least were receptive.
Now tell me about the 1-year program. You said when we did the 2-year program and then the 1-year program. Clarify that, Jim.
The idea of the 1-year program was that they would organize, capitalize, manufacture, sell, close down, all within 1 school year.
So this was like the 30-week program. Wasn't it about 30 weeks?
That.
Yeah.
I didn't mean a calendar year. I meant one school
year. Yes, that's what I wanted to clarify.
1 school, that's good.
Right. All right.
That's good. And then, around the time I left, there was a trend which I understand expanded, started by Carl Flemke in Los Angeles, to two semesters a year program. I found in that, in the couple of years before I left, I found some of the same flaws that were in the 2-year program because there was considerable misrepresentation as to the number of people involved. They were counting the same people twice.
It was a quick way to increase enrollment.
Right.
Yeah, but there was maybe some justification, too, in terms of the volunteer participation.
The big negative in JA is also the biggest positive from a theoretical point of view. And let me backtrack a bit. One of my earliest experiences in Connecticut, I went to a high school program to observe it in New Britain with McCabe. Talking with the principal afterwards, it was a new movie being shown, good enthusiasm. He said, "This is a great idea. I'm surprised the schools haven't taken it over." Then he caught himself. He says, "No, that's what's so great about the idea. Schools couldn't tolerate the chance of failure in a profit and loss system. And we would doctor it up and it would lose meaning. The way you guys are doing it, it has guts to it." He was right then, and it still was right at the time I left, and probably still right today. What happened in the negative side of junior achievement is that because the achievers in the company program were volunteers recruited through the whole school system, because they were volunteers, they could vote with their feet. If they didn't like what they were getting, if it wasn't a challenge, if it wasn't delivering what they'd been promised at the assembly, they didn't come back. So we had attrition. But even that attrition was not lost. The Opinion Research Survey in 1965 developed the fact from the school side of it, where they had interviews with random kids in school, that even if they'd been in the program only a part of the year, they still retained understanding and attitude toward business that put them above those that had not taken part. But the attrition was a serious problem always, because it represented, in all too sensitive measure, the success, the effectiveness of the local staff directing the thing, the local advisors. If a kid dropped out, it might have been because they weren't doing their job right. And so part of my obsession as program director was to have attendance reports from the areas to identify those areas that were suffering undue attrition. And that was a sure sign there was a problem. Another sign of a problem was the charter applications, which show a boy-girl relationship that was way out of whack. You know, I had two organized ways of getting information to evaluate what was going on and to test and formulate new ideas. One was the Kids of the Achievers Conference. For instance, in 1952 at Valley Forge Military Academy, I launched through the discussion groups the idea that JA companies really ought to pay a tax just like business does. And I had a volunteer develop a one-page corporate tax form following the same percentages as the national form, much simpler.
Go ahead, take a drink of water.
The group sold themselves. They went back home flush with the idea. Then I sold it at a staff conference, and we put it in.
Jim, I'd like to chat a little bit about some of the many innovations and improvements that you made to the program over the years as National Program Director. Recall for us some of the things that come to mind.
I mentioned the tax thing.
You just mentioned the tax thing, yeah.
Well, after the tax thing, way back in '52, I think the most significant was the development of the company manual, which came out in '66. I'd had the idea for years that we were too much depending just on the advisors to guide the kids in what they should do, give them the words to say. Had the idea, why not put the words right in front of the kids themselves? So working through the Program Development Committee and through seminars at the conference, we had the idea of the company manual. The first draft of it that Gil Folliher and I prepared, the first draft of it was explained to the kids from the 6 areas that were going to test it, areas that were staffed by the people on the Program Development Committee. We did that, and then the next year, after 1 year experience with it in those 6 areas, Bob Richards led a seminar of kids from those same areas making suggestions at how it could be improved, and some very definite, significant changes were made, so that when the whole big thing was printed for 1966, it involved the input of the achievers at the conference, and I found that very helpful. The conference itself, I tried to provide both continuity and innovation so that people coming back, and as many as 20 or 20% would be returning, that provided continuity, but I didn't want too much continuity or they would get complacent. So I did put little differences in over the years. The biggest one, really, from the term of group dynamics, was in separating most of the returning delegates into special groups so that they did not dominate the conversation of the young people, and so that they had a chance to discuss topics more appropriate to the fact that most of them were graduating seniors. The first year I did it with no prior notice, assigned all of them to one unit in McNutt, if you recall. And by Wednesday, a kind of a rebellion broke out among them, because some of them who'd come back expecting it to lord it over the new kids found that they were just with more of the same and had nobody to lord it over. Joe Kozlowski, no, from Chicago, the unit counselor, unit supervisor, found me in my office and said that there was a rebellion going on, so to speak, in the basement of McNutt in the rec room. I went over, found out the problem, and talked them out of anything drastic. Well, the upshot of it was that the next year, I still kept them separated. I took from the records the returning delegates who had the best record of participation the previous year. I called them group chairmen and had 2 or 3 in every group to sort of provide a model for the new ones and to be help to the counselor. All the others were in the lowest numbered group within a unit. In McNutt, and they were on the ground floor. They were larger than the other groups. And instead of 2 first-year counselors, they had 3 counselors, at least one of whom had 2 or 3 years, was on the way to being a unit supervisor. And that then no problem after that. One of the aspects of the program that I felt was very important was attendance, particularly retention. Did people stay on and go through the year? I tried with limited results to get the regional men to monitor this. I developed a sampling system where on a visit to a program, you could physically, rough numbers, count the number of achievers there and compare that with the attendance reports submitted for that center for that night. And there's no question that there were occasions where reports were doctored. And therefore, the objective validity of looking at the numbers was lost if the numbers were not real. Now, Henry was the only one of the regional men that I knew, Henry Hefner, the only one of the regional men that gave any indication that he took that to heart and tried to implement it. He was a bulldog that way. He discovered defects in the administration in Detroit that were valid.
Brought him some enemies.
And made him very controversial because he was critical of Wally Fleming at Wally Fleming's heyday on his organizational side. Wally Fleming's organizational skills were not masked by his ability to supervise the program. After he lost people like Harry Semenek and Ed Broom, the program was not the same. Right. Going back to the conference, the idea of both the conference and NJA of introducing new contests, new procedures, was a way of making the experience more meaningful to those who already were in, and yet not so radical a change that you're going to make it hard to transmit the idea to those who are new. But the continuity that was provided in the program and at the conference was very important. And it's important to the success of any organization. I learned that very definitely in my years in the training center in the Army, that the continuity of the staff made all the difference in the world.
Jim, I wanted to ask you, how long did you remain in the role of National Program Director? Was that until you retired?
Yes, it was sort of a tricky thing when I first went. I was to be the program director, but out of deference to Herman Gall, I didn't have the title. But the big change came for sure when John Hayne came to New York, because he reinstalled at the start the idea that I should report to Herman Gall, who was out in St. Louis. So I was able to play a nice game with that. John would ask me a question, and I would say, I'll have to check with Herman. So he'd say, well, no, you do that some other time. You tell me right now. So I would tell him, and gradually we forgot about Herman. That again gets to what I mentioned earlier, that the organization side of JA was what always gave me fits, because the program was so good that it deserved to be better organized. One of the chief things at the very beginning was that from the success of the big fundraiser at the Waldorf in 1941, JA started some areas during the war years, and in 1945 particularly, on the basis that the national office would do all the fundraising until the area was able to get on its feet. Well, that didn't work. Talking about it with Mr. Fuller of the Fuller Brush Company, was my chairman in Hartford, and a wonderful man, had such a great interest in JA. He told me, he said, look, he said, I questioned that at the time, but this is another field of business. I figure they know what they're doing. They obviously didn't. So I had the privilege, based on some lean months in Hartford, that when I was able to get Bridgeport started, my predecessor had raised money in Bridgeport but not provided any program. So I felt a moral obligation in the fall of '46 to get a program going. I did. And after 1 year, Don Monahan was the director, assistant out of Hartford, I sold the Bridgeport board on taking on full responsibility for their own funds and of hiring Monahan to be their director. I understand the only other area at that time that had started with money, with a commitment, was Peoria. But that was told me when I first came with JA. But the point was that the money was there, but to not ask for it, to say, we'll get it for you later, it just didn't work. Yeah. And Cleveland was an example where the money was brought in first. That's why it was easy to get it started there so well.
Jim, you mentioned Mr. Fuller and you mentioned Mr. Colgate earlier. Who are some of the individuals that you most remember, business leaders and so forth, leaders in their field that you had a chance to get to know and work with?
Well, I would say Mr. Fuller most of all, and then the people at what's then known as the Wallace Barnes Company, now known as Barnes Associates in Bristol, Connecticut. Mr. Fuller Barnes, just before I left there in '48, told me, and he set the budget for the program and raised all the money in one day at a luncheon for the business executives in town. He said there's no limit to how big this program could get here, but you've got to depend on me to set the scale of it. He said, my wife, my family would participate in other philanthropies here in town. We have to feel our way. We don't want to hog it all. We want to bring others along. We want to do it at a solid pace that will last. So he said, you deliver the program, I'll deliver the money, and we'll agree on how much program the money will buy, work it all out that way. And it was what led to McCabe's downfall was that he went behind Mr. Fuller's back and tries to raise money for the general program from Bristol people that Mr. Barnes had not solicited. And that made him very upset, and he closed the program down.
Any others that really stick out in your mind?
The one that is the most interesting was when we had Jack Rathbone of Standard Oil in New Jersey heading up a fundraising on national level. And he had some wonderful results, some limited results because areas like Chicago wouldn't take part. But it was really great. He was kind enough at one of the meetings to comment favorably on a presentation I had made at a previous one, so that made a hit. After we moved up here, I looked up the widow of the operations sergeant in my field artillery battalion, Grace Rathbone. I never made the connection until we're taking Grace out to dinner past an SO station, and she said, "Oh, there's another station." My brother-in-law always was proud of those stations. I said, "You mean Jack Rathbone?" "Why, yes." And it would have been so wonderful if I could have told Jack, while he was still alive, about my experiences with his brother, an older man who was an art professor and volunteered in the Army at the age of 40 and was wonderful in our battalion. If I could have told him I knew about the good things about each of them. That was the closest I ever came to really regretting I hadn't said that one more word when you hear a new name.
Yeah. Jim, how long did you remain with the national headquarters? When did you elect to retire from JA, and what prompted that decision?
What prompted, I retired in end of February 1978. What prompted it was some internal things with Mr. Maxwell, because
and Mr. Maxwell at that point
was the president,
new president of Junior Achievement,
and the question of first had been the question of moving to Connecticut. When they moved, I was kind of reluctant after living all my life there in Jersey. I offered to work part-time on NAJAC and the seminar, and he didn't buy that. Then I came up here with Johnny, and we looked around and liked what we saw, so they moved us up here in 75.
I was just asking you, when you retired.
Oh,
I want to go on to some more
in the fall of 77, I remember it well. I was invited to a meeting that Julie Hubbard was called. She'd been hired from Fort Wayne to set up this in-school program.
Great.
And
first in-school program.
I was invited. No, it wasn't the first, really, because the first was two things. One was those school savings banks in Georgia and Birmingham, and the other was the stuff that Jim Rich did in Dayton, Ohio.
He was way ahead of his time.
Well, ahead or behind, according to how you look at it.
In a sense.
Anyway, I was at this meeting,
and
there were some things stated as assumptions that I questioned, and I was about to speak. But then something was said that we got to get this in shape for launching in 2 years. So it came over me that I was 63 at the time. I was due to retire at 65. I wouldn't be around to stay with the idea, and I felt morally, ethically, I shouldn't muddy the waters when I was that close to retirement. And then to top that thought was the realization that had they recognized I was so close, they probably wouldn't have invited me to the meeting. So I think within a day or so of that, just as I was about to go away on a trip for the Program Development Committee meeting, I popped in and caught Mr. Maxwell in, and I told him I was leaving. So I left when I was about 63 and a half. And
after a very, very illustrious career with JA, I might add. It had some great disappointments, but it had some great thrills. And probably for me personally, the greatest thing about it has been the continued association by visits, by mail, by phone calls with people like yourself that I knew as achievers.
As I say, dating back to 1948, I'm still in touch with Betty Wham.
Hundreds and hundreds, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Jim, I want to come back to the program a little later, but I have some other questions I want to share with you or ask of you. You mentioned a memorable experience. If you look back in retrospect, are you able to identify any one or two most memorable experiences in your entire career with JA?
Well, I'd like to think one, and like so many others, it didn't always pan out. The day that DeWitt Wallace of the Reader's Digest dropped in the office unannounced looking for Joe Francomano, who was out of town, I was referred to him. Mr. Wallace pulled some notes out of his pocket that he'd taken at lunch. This was at the time of the 60s protests and all. And he said, I think that junior achievers could make a contribution to the problems in this country today with their diligence, with what they learn about working for a living. He said, I'd be willing to pay the expenses for achievers to go places and give talks to businessmen conventions to show them that there are young people today that have their feet on the ground. Well, I did some quick thinking, and I thought, that's a great idea, but where would you get the kids? And the answer was quite obvious. We'd get them from what we knew of people and their participation at the Achievers Conference. And so I told him that in a few words. He asked me to write it up. I consulted with Joe. We went up to the Digest once, prepared a presentation, and the long and short of it was that he paid the expenses for the first Reader's Digest Speakers Course Seminar, we called it, in New York City. Ann Landers was the moderator of the panel where the kids that had been developed over the couple of preceding days were on the panel with businessmen, and great results. Mr. Wallace liked it so much because I had the kids always write him after they made a speech, and he got in personal correspondence with these kids to the mutual enjoyment of all. He liked it so much that he endowed it with $500,000.
Wow.
And we were able to pay expenses. We were able to pay for a seminar in the fall to train the kids that we had selected. They had to apply. They had to agree to come to the seminar. And we got better each year at it. The last few years we had it at a conference center here in Connecticut with closed circuit TV, so each person could make a presentation at the start, learn how to make presentations, and then at the end make another and compare the two. Wonderful stuff. Well, anyway, that really had so many ramifications because they spoke at a number of business conventions. They spoke at a lot of JA meetings where they would be a good example for the other kids in the audience. They just made a big difference. And I was very sorry to learn that JA had dropped it. I guess it was hard to administer. I was juggling all the years I was there. I feel I was understaffed. I know I was understaffed. And my problem was that when I hired good people like Gil Follower or Mary Beth Vernon, after a few years, they would be tapped for some other greater responsibility. Glad to see them go, but then they're gone. And I was always trying to find somebody new to take their place.
But Jim Sweeny disciples, nonetheless. Jim, it may be hard to top that one, but any other most memorable experiences before we move on? I know I'm testing you unwarned here, but and we can certainly come back to this. But
I showed you earlier the plaque that you folks gave me at 1968. At the 1968 conference, for the first time, having been invited many times before, Johnny said she would come to the thing, which delightfully surprised me. I found out why, because she got there late in the week, and then some device I was hornswoggled into turning in my rented car or lending it to someone else, and Tom Schober would take me up to the airport with Johnny. Well, that was fine. It was different from what we'd done before. I was the last to leave, as always. We get up to the airport. Just at the entrance, going toward the terminal, was a Holiday Inn motel. Great big sign out front. Welcome, Jim Sweeny. God, there's another Jim Sweeny. It was me. It was a complete surprise. Complete surprise. And there were people there from the very first conference, Alvin Outcall, and everything in between. A lot of the current counselors, Ron Cody, I guess.
Absolutely, I remember.
And
very proud.
it was a real thrill. I should have quit when I was ahead, right then and there. But it was so nice, I thought I'd stay around for a little longer.
A very important event.
But you know, this touches on a lot of things about JA and about its attention. At that conference, Alvin Outcall had been elected president at the first conference in 1944. He was an achiever from Belleville, New Jersey. At the time they tracked him down and invited him, he had just gone to work as public relations director for International Paper. He was reluctant to hit his new boss with the need to have extra time off to go to this meeting. But he got in to tell the boss that he hoped he could get off this extra day, and found to his great surprise that the boss didn't know he was in junior achievement. Why he didn't know? Alvin never told him. Why didn't Alvin ever tell him? Alvin was not aware of the growth that JA had experienced, that it was something to be proud of, to share with other people. The boss immediately said, take all the time you want. No wonder you're so good. No wonder I hired you. You were in JA.
Oh, great story.
Jim, you have influenced a lot of people during your life and during your career in junior achievement, truthfully. But there must be a few individuals that have most influenced you during your lifetime and during your career. Now, I know you got to pause and think about that for a moment, but what individuals come to mind in terms of having the greatest impact or influence on you and who you are?
Well, it is right off the top of my head, but I would say George Tamlin, because he picked me for the job and he accepted some of my recommendations, which were contrary to what had been going on. I think Alfred Fuller, who set as an example of integrity in business, of generosity, of calmness, of wisdom, that I so admired. I would be in his office. I learned if I went to see him at 11:30 in the morning, I could get my business done and be invited to lunch in the company cafeteria with him. And since I was sending letters in his name all over the state, his phone would ring and I could tell from who he addressed, who he was talking to. There were businessmen all over the state and all over the country that called Alfred Fuller for advice and comment on their proposals, because he had such a reputation for judgment. And one thing impressed me about him was his utter humility. He told me that the success of the Fuller Brush Company, the stereotype of the Fuller Brush man, was because early on he recognized his innate shyness. He had trouble selling his first brushes when he was making them all himself on a little hand mandrel. So his first move to business success was to hire someone to do the selling. That lasted all his life, putting the right people in the right job within that organization. And he outlived the organization because he had to give it up when his sons couldn't take it over. It was a private company, and he sold it. But he had such integrity and such wisdom that just being around him a little had to rub off. Another man I greatly respected was Kirby Risk in Lafayette, Indiana. He tried to get an intermediate program started there and was turned aside by Herman Gall. Then he heard about the correspondence plan, and he started that with me. I hadn't known about the Gall incident. That confidence he had in the program, it became an intermediate program. It became a full-time program, been there for years, and he gave so much to it. And in a small town, relatively small town, to have such an impact certainly made a difference. He was the big motivator of that wonderful multi-purpose community center that serves both for the senior center, the JA Business Center, and the Parks Department shops. Wonderful combination in a practical way. And also it serves to release the $60,000 that kicked it off from the trust fund. It's Jenks Rest. It also serves as a community restroom because it's got a door to the outside in terms of stipulation in Mr. Jenks' will. Another one that I learned to admire, I didn't see him that closely, but every time I did, it was so impressive, was Mr. DeWitt Wallace, because he put his money where his mouth was. Always was that way. Very generous, and for instance, he came to me with a proposition to sponsor a scholarship to McAllister College. And I knew him then, by then I knew him well enough I could talk frankly. I said, Mr. Wallace, the best kids in JA that you want, frankly, don't want to go to McAllister. So I would be happy to advertise a McAllister scholarship, but I suggest you offer some cash awards also for kids that are going to go to the more selective schools, and so that you'll have contact with them and know what you've achieved with your money. And he bought that idea, and that worked. I don't know whether it's still going, but it worked for a number of years. McAllister didn't last. The one boy that won the first year went part of the year, and then he continued back home in Detroit. But people like that generation of businessmen that were accessible to you. One day in Wintertown, Ohio, for some meeting, Joe Frankenman and I were in the hotel late at night after the meeting, and there's Mr. Hook walking down the hallway. And so we introduced Joe. Of course, had seen more of Mr. Hook than I had, and they get talking. What are you doing here late at night like this, Mr. Hook? Well, he said, some secretaries in the office were having a farewell party for one who's retiring, and I just thought I ought to look in. Well, that's an example of a kind of, some people would call it paternalism, but I would call it just good human relations. And that sort of thing is sorely lacking. The scandals, the problems of recent years, I just can't believe it's the same kind of people. I know it's not the same kind of people. It's not. One of our earlier meetings, I had Mr. Fuller go along with me to some promotional meetings in other towns. And the first time I asked him, he said, you get an expense account for your car, don't you? I said, yes. Well, he said, I'd like you to take me because I don't feel right about keeping my chauffeur out on my private business. And, just that kind of attitude of doing things right.
Absolutely. Yep.
That kind of attitude of doing things. Mr. Fuller, for example, after the war, he had put in during the war a machine shop as an adjunct to his plant, making more material. Because the old plant in Hartford, all those machines they had invented and made for themselves to do all these brush making operations. He had this machine shop. After the war, other plants were selling off their shops for nothing. He had built up a skilled force of people there. He felt an obligation to them not to throw them out in the street. He felt an obligation to his business to keep on making money. So he got into the contract machine tool business for the companies around New England, where they would make the tools on a contract basis and kept that part humming. And I'm sure that any of the machines that had to be made for Fuller Brush were that much better because they had this trained force of men working. That kind of attitude.
It is obvious to everyone who will have the great pleasure and opportunity to listen to this tape to know that Jim could go on for hours. And we may have to do a phase 2 interview. But I do want to keep us on track and ask another tough question that may cause you to think a little bit. You probably touched on some of this in the nearly 2 hours we've been talking now. But looking back over your career, Jim, what is, if you had to point to a single greatest success, at least in your own terms, and a disappointment, something that you wish had gone differently, does anything come to mind, especially the success?
Well, I think one of the most dramatic successes was his company manual, because it greatly extended the scope of the advisor job. They didn't have to tell the kids things the kids could read themselves. They could really give them advice. I had the experience the first year of the completed manual. Visited the program in Bridgeport, which I kept in touch with because I lived around here and I had started it. There was a young man presiding by the book, unassuming sort of a fellow. The kids had elected him for whatever reason the previous week. With the book in front of him, he led that meeting in a way that had everybody's respect, attention, decision-making, followed right along. The advisors were sitting there in their role as advisors. And it just was so much better than the advisor having to tell a kid every time to lift a finger and what to do, because they could read it in the book. By the same token, the advisor, the beauty of that manual was the advisor had the same manual, except they had additional instructions and suggestions in red ink for the advisor's use. You remember it.
Absolutely.
And visiting areas, I visited all the areas that had been part of the test. And it really went over great. It really went over great. It was the biggest publication job that ever J.A. had. It was nice to know that so many hundreds of thousands of these books were going to be laying around the country gathering memento value.
I've got mine.
But it worked. It worked. And the other aspect related to it was that our experimental programs, first the intermediate program in small towns, then the correspondence program in very small town, was a constant test of the value of the expository materials. You have the 1, 2, 3. You read it, it makes sense. You can do it. And I made a point of always visiting in my trips, always tying in a trip to make a side trip somewhere to one of those small companies, because there was nothing but the book. And the program itself had such inherent merit. I remember going to one on the way of a trip, stopping in a small town near Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, forgot the name, where the Chamber of Commerce executive wanted to have J.A. And she had arranged for my visit for some of the business people and some of the school people to be at the meeting. I gave my presentation. They were to have assembly programs the next week with a film and applications and all. I finished, and the school superintendent let me down very easily. He said, you know, this is very interesting, but you won't find anyone who wants to be in it here, because our young people have everything. They have all kinds of activities. They won't be interested. Well, I thought on the spur of the moment, I said, well, the worst can happen. Nobody signs up. We'll get Life magazine in here. This is the town that has everything. Well, the next week, the Chamber of Commerce secretary called up. She said, this is the town that now has JA. The program went over great. We're flooded with applications. The school people are red in the face. The kids love this idea. You know,
yeah,
that made such a hit.
Hard to top that one.
Hard.
Any disappointment or thing you really didn't get to finish before you retired from JA?
Well, my retiring, as I told you, was sort of impulsive. But I did give plenty of notice. I told them at the end of November that I wanted to leave the end of February. There was no effort that I know of to find a replacement while I was still there, so there could be an orderly transition, the kind of orderly transition that had been part of my makeup for the program and for the conference all those years. Didn't happen. It was months after I left before Alan Kirtley was brought in, and even then on a reorganized basis. But before I left, I did leave word on all the things that were pending, So it wasn't a complete loss, but that was a very great disappointment.
Yeah.
And
Appreciate that.
another one was, of course, I was back in '93 at the Achievers Conference in Indiana, the last time it was there, and the next to the last time that it ever was. And I was so disappointed that after the years we were there and all the favorable associations, the way those folks had given us so much support, we gave them a lot of attention too. Herman Wells, when he was president, used to sit in on the discussion groups. It was great. And then to look out the window of the hotel or the office and see them loading up the truck with the supplies from the supply room that had built up. They gave us a room of our own to keep supplies in from year to year. Was disappointing. And to find that the council organization had been thrown away, continuity lost, all that sort of thing. I could see that it was on the way out, but it took 15 years after I left for it to finally die off.
Yeah.
But it did have to be refreshed. It did have to have somebody running it that knew what he wanted and worked at it. That's the other thing that I was very sorry to see disappear was the machinery. That was one of the fascinations for the kids, and
That made it real.
made it real, and it made participate. It was hard. In many cases, it was hard. It was a challenge to the advisors to find things that could be made. Much ingenuity there. Now, I got on that. I forget how it happened, but I got on the National Safety Council for years, and I applied National Safety Council standards to JA reporting, only more so. And the accident record was pretty good. The way I understand it, it fell off fast after a couple of years and led to the insurance company telling them they couldn't have machinery. Well, my feeling would have been to make the corrective steps to still use the machinery.
Absolutely.
Right? As against just giving up. Because with that went a lot. Another problem that seemed to have gotten worse with time was this matter of desegregation. JA and the JA conference are way ahead of the rest of the country in properly, effectively integrating people from all parts of society. We had been for many years. Even when the South was segregated, the North was, of course, integrated, JA was integrated. Within a few years after I left, I came across the fact that JA was seeking out segregated situations for business centers. My theory was when I started Cleveland, we found a location for the first business center that was equally accessible to Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, and the Woodland district of Cleveland, which anyone from around there knows.
I lived there.
See?
2 years.
That was the best kind of integration because the kind of people we wanted came to the JA meeting. And it got so much refined that there was an example when Henry Hefner was in Cleveland. He invited me to look in there at a problem on a trip. In the Woodland area, a big project, they wanted to have the center there, in effect, segregated. But I met with the folks there, and the reason they wanted it was some of their best kids wanted to be in the program, but they didn't want to spend the travel time to the JA Center where it was located. They knew that if they had a program in their own community, they could go to citywide things without any problem, but they would save that travel time. Now, I'm not sure whether they were right or wrong, but you had to respect their initiative and their judgment, and Henry went along with it. And I looked in later on, and it was going great. Things like that come to you. But there were many challenges that happened over the years. The program ones were, by and large, solved. The organization ones weren't. They really weren't. And some of the top staff people were, for instance, one that doesn't get much attention in JA. It was a couple of years that John Davis Lodge was president. There was a man came with no experience in the field. He sized us up. He let us do our job. He did his job, which was to sell JA. He did it very effectively, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Very effectively.
Yes, I think so.
Akron got started during his term. He did a very effective job. But well, there are two cases where people came off the executive committee, and neither of them were effective. We had so many good people involved that we should have done better on an organizational basis.
Jim, to continue our interview and drive to a conclusion, as I say, we may have to continue this sometime, but what would you like, in terms of your career in junior achievement, what would you like to be remembered for?
Well, I think on a personal basis, the Achievers Conference meant a lot to me because I got to know people personally, and it was a way of checking up on the program, which sometimes the local areas didn't appreciate. But it was a personal side of it. But as I think what I really would like to be remembered for is that at the time I started, JA was on the threshold of a great expansion. It had a basic program that was very moving, very effective, but it originally, as it was launched in '45, before I came with it, had a number of trivia, of irritations that kept it from being truly effective, like a 2-year program. So I feel I made a contribution by doing what it took in the way of agitating and demonstrating to replace the 2-year program with a 1-year program, to begin measuring quantity by attendance reports, to begin measuring quality by contests that would give evidence of the results that could be attained, to begin measuring the effectiveness by the work that we did with the Opinion Research Survey back in '65. All those things that perhaps had they been continued at a constant pace would have helped the program evolve into what needed to be done in the changing economic situation. Because certainly the disappearance of the kind of manufacturing industries in this country where we recruited advisors and sponsors, that has made a big difference in something like junior achievement, where people are asked to volunteer their time and do a job. The program itself was, as I say, was proven time and again through the remote operations like the correspondence plan to be something that could be done. People could read it and do it. We had the materials to make it possible. We had that wonderful bookkeeping system that worked out with the American Institute of Public Accountants back when that association was noted for its integrity and its precision, and was accepted by advisors all over the country. Things like that. The other thing I tried to do was to capitalize on the human possibilities, the people that were developed, both through the conference, and then I felt so highly that the Reader's Digest seminar achieved that purpose by giving a limited number of our most fluent achievers a chance to speak in our behalf and in their own. Things like that. I think it's classified, to classify it would be a matter of helping people develop their personal goals. Did I say earlier about the meeting in Washington where D. Polinsky answered a question?
Go ahead, tell us.
Photographers Convention and Photographic Manufacturers Convention at the Madison Hotel in Washington. After the 4 Achiever panelists had finished their presentation, a woman in the audience, one of the members of the association, challenged Dee Polinsky. He said, Dee, this is all very good, but you certainly are not a typical achiever. I mean, you're not a typical young person.
Typical young person.
And Dee said forthrightly, I should hope not. She said, I work too hard to be a little better, but I don't want to be called typical. And that epitomizes so many of the kids who found themselves in JA. You know, the thing time and again when we go to new areas, and the people there, both business and school people, would wonder about who would join. We knew people would join from all parts of the school community. The nerd, the slow one, not good in a social setting, but in JA, being social with a small s, they would blossom. They would take responsibility. They would win the respect of their fellows. That happened time and again, thousands of times. At the same time, it's important to remember that JA in its heyday in the 50s sold itself as a public relations program for industry. We got our support only from industry. We weren't looking for handouts from government or private individuals, only from industry, whom we benefited. We benefited by the attitude we convey in the town that the business people were interested in the young people. In small towns, it had a particular flavor because in examples I can remember, individual examples, it reversed that pattern of the kid from the small town sees no future in the plant where dad worked, so they go looking elsewhere. At the same time, the plant brings in someone from out of town that is not accustomed to that atmosphere and is not happy. An example was once I had occasion to call Donald Rennie, the personnel man at Chesapeake Corporation of Virginia, had a very successful correspondence plan in about 5 Delta towns there in Virginia. I called and asked for Mr. Rennie. The voice of the receiver, switchboard operator, said, "Oh, hello, Mr. Sweeny. This is so-and-so, one of the achievers from that program who'd been at the national conference and had been hired to be their receptionist, where otherwise she would have gone to Richmond or Newport News or someplace looking for a job because there weren't many jobs in West Point." Things like that. The human side of it was very important, very exciting, very satisfying.
Jim, I should ask you before we conclude, is there any other topic, area of your career that we should touch on? I might add a couple words in terms of what an individual like yourself will be remembered for by the graduate achievers. I can speak on behalf of them. A man of tremendous integrity, honesty, commitment, compassion for young people and for the values of the JA program and so forth. I've been so honored to sit here and interview you, and I mean that. I have to acknowledge, I wish we had video as well as audio, because I have to mention the fact that Jim Sweeny is sitting here with his JA tie on today, and I'm terribly, terribly impressed.
That's your honor.
Well, in honor of the interview, let's put it that way. But I was very, very impressed. I noticed it the minute I walked up to you. Jim, any closing comments on the that you want to share on the tape?
No, except that, as I say, the dividend of those years with JA has been on the personal, human side, in the fact of the people that have kept in touch. And I just hope that this oral history program will reach out and catch some of them, and not just the first one you've come across, but someone that person has kept in touch with, and so on, ad infinitum. The idea is very sound, and to me, is the reason I brought up at that first meeting I got in on a couple of years ago, is that JA is much more than a collection of manuals and souvenirs and trivia. It's the people who took part, and not just the achievers. their parents, their advisors, the town through the school people, all of them have contributed because there was a lot of involvement. The big negative was that it did operate in the best tenets of a profit and loss system. Kids dropped out, companies failed sometimes. Some had fantastic success. But even those that dropped out got something from the time they were in there. The opinion research survey proves that. It just is a good experience, and the nicest thing is that it's a continuing experience through keeping in touch with these people.
Good. Thanks a lot, Jim. Thanks for sharing all your views. After we listen to the tape, if we find we missed anything, we'll come back. Yeah, another thought?
No.
Oh, come on. One more thought.
Well,
please, the tape's running.
one of the disappointments on the organizational side was the pension plan, because in 1948, George Tamlin introduced a plan for the first time, a 5% participation by employees and by management. To make it palatable, everybody got an automatic 5% raise in 48 to cover that 5%. So mechanically, from then on, you'd never notice it, in addition to whatever merit raise you might have gotten. But when they decentralized after George Tamlin left in 1950, areas were allowed to withdraw not just the employees. If an employee left early, he could not only withdraw what he had put in plus interest, but instead of leaving the area side there to go toward the pension for his successor, he was allowed to take that out at the request of his local board. That really gutted the potential for those that go the whole route and stay with it effectively, successfully through retirement. It would have been much more attractive had that stayed in place as it was intended. It also originally was a compulsory plan, a condition of employment. That was diluted over the years. And areas were allowed staff to have their own sort of plan, and then they come back to JA because it didn't work. A lot of that's gone on that led to misunderstanding and bad results within the organization. But the original plan was really great, and I don't know where I fit into it. My benefits was balanced off right at the threshold between the original system and the newer system that was instituted later. And so they tried to figure out the best way for me. I hope they did. But actually, the positive effect of that disaster was that I learned early that if I wanted to stay with this, and I did enjoy it, I'd better put some money aside because it wasn't going to come from the organization. And it was because the idea of the pension plan is that the fund builds up the earnings on which will pay for the pensions of future employees.
A lesson that young people are having to learn today, believe me. Again, Jim, thanks a lot. We'll hope that Gil and the crew is satisfied with the tape.